6. Sartre. With Jean-Paul Sartre, born 1905, a relative of Albert Schweitzer, we find ourselves in the world of radical existentialism. The extent to which Sartre has sought to be consistent in his existentialism appears strikingly in the title of his major work, Being and Nothingness. Why not, one may well wonder, being and freedom, since so radical an urge to freedom governs his philosophy? Again, why not title the work Being and Essence, or Existence and Essence, since a sharp separation of the two is so important a starting point for Sartre? The reason for Sartre's title rests with Sartre himself, but perhaps an aspect of his title choice was a bypassing of the traditional aspects of philosophy. Nothingness for Sartre is given. It is at the heart of being. Sartre wants no dualism of being and non-being, or of being and nothingness. Man presents himself as a being who causes nothingness to arise in the world, inasmuch as he himself is affected with non-being to this end. In brief, non-being exists only on the surface of being. Sartre's doctrine of nothingness is a parallel to the biblical doctrine of creation out of nothing. If man, as the new God, is to create his own essence, then he must do so out of nothingness, as Reinhardt noted. Christianity teaches not only that everything that it was created out of nothing, but also that everything would sink back into nothingness the moment God were to withdraw his all-sustaining creative power. This is why Nietzsche or Sartre's man without God moves in a meaningless void which he vainly and desperately tries to populate with the stillborn creatures of his own whims and fancies. And since in Christianity, as in no other religion, man's existence is absolutely grounded in God, the atrophy of faith in God must of necessity lead to the most horrible experience of the abyss of annihilation and nothingness. Nothingness is thus a necessity for Sartre's being in order to ensure man's freedom to be God, but it also haunts being and is a continuing plague to it. Sartre's philosophy seeks to be realistic in terms of man in the modern world. In regarding with approval Castro's Cuban Revolution, Sartre titled a chapter in part, Death to Abstract Principles. These words echo in part the temper of the modern mind and Sartre's existentialism, but the reality is that a new set of abstract principles prevails. Sartre's being is one of these new abstractions. Sartre introduces a Cartesian dualism between being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself is the self-contained being of a thing, whereas being for itself is coextensive with the realm of consciousness, and the nature of consciousness is that it is perpetually beyond itself. Add to this fact that existence precedes essence, as Sartre points out. Atheistic existentialism states that if God did not exist, there is at least one being in whom existence precedes essence, a being who exists before he can be defined by any concept, and this being is man, or as Heidegger says, human reality. What is meant here by saying that existence precedes essence? It means that, first of all, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. If man, as the existentialist conceives him, is indefinable, it is because at first he is nothing. Only afterwards will he be something, and he himself will have made what he will be. Thus there is no human nature, since there is no God to conceive it. Not only is man what he conceives himself to be, but he is also only what he wills himself to be after this thrust towards existence. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Such is the first principle of existentialism. Sartre defines existentialism as the belief that existence precedes essence, or if you prefer, that subjectivity must be the starting point. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Because man is alone in the world, man is both totally free and totally responsible in that he is the new maker of himself. Dostoevsky said, "If God didn't exist, everything would be possible." That is the very starting point of existentialism. Indeed, everything is permissible if God does not exist, and as a result, man is forlorn because neither within him nor without does he find anything to cling to. He can't start making excuses for himself. If existence really does precede essence, there is no explaining things away by reference to a fixed and given human nature. In other words, there is no determinism. Man is free. Man is freedom. On the other hand, if God does not exist, we find no values or commands to turn to which legitimize our conduct. So, in the bright realm of values, we have no excuse behind us, nor justification before us. We are alone with no excuses. That is the idea I shall try to convey when I say that man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, yet, in other respects, is free because, once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. The existentialist does not believe in the power of passion. He will never agree that a sweeping passion is a ravaging torrent, which fatally leads a man to certain acts, and is therefore an excuse. He thinks that man is responsible for his passion. Bonge, in a very fine article, has said, "Man is the future of man." That's exactly it. To maintain this radical freedom and responsibility, Sartre denied the validity of the concepts of the unconscious and of Freud's psychoanalytic theory. It cannot be true because man is freedom, not a product of the id. Man is freedom because there is no God who created him, determined man's nature and history, or established a law over man. The freedom of man is his urge to be God, to be his own maker and determiner. Thus, the best way to conceive of the fundamental project of human reality is to say that man is a being whose project is to be God. To be man means to reach towards being God, or if you prefer, man fundamentally is the desire to be God. It may be asked if man, on coming into the world, is born towards God as towards his limit. If he can choose only to be God, what becomes of freedom? For freedom is nothing other than a choice which creates for itself its own possibilities. But it appears here that the initial project of being God, which defines man, comes close to being the same as a human nature or an essence. The answer is that while the meaning of the desire is ultimately the project of being God, the desire is never constituted by this meaning. On the contrary, it always represents a particular discovery of its ends. The only being which can be called free is the being which annihilates its being. Moreover, we know that annihilation is lack of being and cannot be otherwise. Freedom is precisely the being which makes itself a lack of being. The threat is clearly seen by Sartre. To say that man is the being whose project is to be God is in effect to ascribe a nature or essence to man. Only by placing a nothingness between man and his goal, the desire to become God, does Sartre escape rather dubiously from giving man a nature. For Sartre, man makes himself man in order to be God. Sartre is at great pains to avoid giving man a nature. Because man is in process of making himself, it becomes difficult to affix responsibility to this ostensibly totally responsible being. The man guilty of a crime yesterday is not the same man who we face today. If it is demanded that a homosexual frankly admit that he is one in the name of sincerity and truth, have we not identified an act and the man? The critic asks the man then to be what he is in order no longer to be what he is. It is the profound meaning of the saying, "A sin confessed is half pardoned." The critic demands of the guilty one that he constitute himself as a thing precisely in order no longer to treat him as a thing. Thus, mad faith and sincerity are for Sartre not very different. There is thus freedom, and there is responsibility, but no guilt, since man is responsible to himself. Instead of an antithesis between good and evil, there is a Hegelian synthesis as the road to freedom realized as God. Not surprisingly, Sartre found a hero or saint in a criminal who denied guilt and affirmed his freedom in acts against God's order. God, in the Christian philosophy, is the principle of definition because he is the sovereign Lord and Creator. All facts, being created facts, have their true meaning only in and through God. Sartre's man, like God, is the principle of definition. This means that man cannot define himself because of his freedom. Much of Sartre's painstaking labour in being and nothingness is his attempt to analyse man without defining him, to know man without ascribing a nature or essence to man. God's freedom is that he is the sovereign God. He has an absolute, perfect, uncreated and unchanging being and essence. Man's freedom in Sartre is negative in essence. Man's freedom is from God for Sartre. This freedom leaves man without essence, without meaning, with only being. There is therefore no possibility of definition. Medieval philosophy sought with precision to define the nature of God. Sartre seeks the same precision to understand man without defining him, an amazing effort. Sartre's being and nothingness is the theology of man spelled out with precision, if the word precision can be used for the undefined. Significantly, Part 1 is titled, The Problem of Nothingness. The old question, how many angels can dance on the head of a needle, is more relevant than much of Sartre's philosophy. Significantly, as Sartre deals with man's nature without calling it a nature, he considers shame in reference not to God, but to the other. Shame is by nature recognition. I recognize that I am as the order sees me. The order is, of course, other men, here designated and capitalized as the other. Man's freedom is arbitrary. Man's only responsibility is to himself. In Speer's summary words, man is the only measure of all value and all truth in Sartre. Since every man has this same arbitrary freedom, the freedom of the other is a threat to man's freedom, and a man's neighbour is his greatest problem and threat. At the same time, the other can cause man to know shame, and in this sense is like the God of Scripture, who brings man to shame with the self-knowledge of his nakedness before God. Sartre's individual is a being in process of making himself God. Until that process is realized, the other functions as man's God and devil. Man's being is without essence for Sartre, and there is no beyond. God, if he exists, is irrelevant because man's being is still by definition without essence, that is, uncreated and undetermined by that God. Sartre's man cannot know himself because he has no essence or nature. He is in process of becoming God, but in that process he is still beyond definition. How then can man even know that he is in process? At this point, the other enters as the new God, in effect, the new principle of definition, insofar as any definition can exist. The philosophies of Descartes and Kant to the contrary, through the I think, we reach our own self in the presence of others, and the others are just as real to us as our own self. Thus, the man who becomes aware of himself through the cogito also perceives all others, and he perceives them as a condition of his own existence. He realizes that he cannot be anything in the sense that we say that someone is witty or nasty or jealous, unless others recognize it as such. In order to get any truth about myself, I must have contact with another person. The other is indispensable to my own existence, as well as to my knowledge about myself. This being so, in discovering my inner being, I discover the other person at the same time, like a freedom placed in front of me which thinks and wills only for or against me. Hence, let me at once announce the discovery of a world which we shall call intersubjectivity. This is the world in which man decides what he is and what others are. Besides, if it is impossible to find in every man some universal essence, which would be human nature, yet there does exist a universal human condition. It's not by chance that today's thinkers speak more readily of man's condition than of his nature. By condition, they mean, more or less definitely, the a priori limits which outline man's fundamental situation in the universe. God is no longer the condition of man's existence. Others are. Man does not have a universal essence which would be human nature. He does have a condition, that is, his fundamental situation in the universe. It would be easy to say that this condition imposes limitations and governments on man, internally and externally, so that a nature of man can be spoken of. But let us grant Sartre his intense desire to escape a nature or essence. Let us also grant him his meaning for man's freedom and responsibility. The essential consequence of our earlier remarks is that man, being condemned to be free, carries the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. He is responsible for the world and for himself as a way of being. We are taking the word responsibility in its ordinary sense as consciousness of being the incontestable author of an event or of an object. It's strange that this man, who is condemned to be free and whose freedom is to become God, should find the other so great a threat. The appearance of the other in the world corresponds, therefore, to a fixed sliding of the whole universe, to a decentralization of the world which undermines the centralization which I am simultaneously offering. As Streller summed it up in his analysis of Sartre, the other robs me of my world. It is through the individual that the world exists, but this is not true of the other. Human reality remains alone because the other's existence has the nature of a contingent and irreducible fact. We encounter the other, we do not constitute him. The world exists through me, but the other alters that world, for the other's look as the necessary condition of my objectivity is the destruction of all objectivity for me. The other's look touches me across the world and is not only a transformation of myself, but a total metamorphosis of the world. I am looked at in a world which is looked at. All this is not surprising. Having removed God as the beyond of his philosophy, Sartre as a new and imminent beyond to threaten and determine him, to fill him with shame and self-consciousness, Sartre cannot escape into a world where he is not looked at. How much the other is a threat to Sartre appears in his treatment of sex. Sex is not for him a harmless matter. Again, the man-woman relationship is not seen in Christian terms, with the woman as man's helpmeet in his calling. The sexual act is loaded with desire for communication, which is metaphysical. In common with much modern thought, Sartre is in quest of cosmic coition. But the act is dangerous. The whole is nothingness to be filled with man's flesh. It calls for a sacrifice of man's body to bring into existence the plenitude of being. In Sartre's words, it is only from this standpoint that we can pass on to sexuality. The obscenity of the feminine sex is that of everything which gapes open. It is an appeal to being as all holds are. In herself, woman appeals to a strange flesh which is to transform her into a fullness of being by penetration and dissolution. Conversely, woman senses her condition as an appeal precisely because she is in the form of a whole. This is the true origin of Adler's complex. Beyond any doubts, her sex is a mouth, and a voracious mouth which devours the penis. a fact which can easily lead to the idea of castration. The amorous acts is the castration of the man, but this is above all because sex is a whole. We have to do here with a pre-sexual contribution which will become one of the components of sexuality as an empirical, complex human attitude, but which, far from deriving its origin from the sexed being, has nothing in common with basic sexuality, the nature of which we have explained in Part 3. Nevertheless, the experience with the whole, when the infant sees the reality, includes the ontological presentiment of sexual experience in general. It is with his flesh that the child stops up the whole, and the whole, before all sexual specification, is an obscene expectation, an appeal to the flesh. In No Exit, Sartre has Garcin declare, hell is other people. As Levi has very aptly observed, hell is other people for Sartre because, in his quaint universe of appropriation and domination, a kind of Hobbesian state of nature where the stakes are not the externals of wealth and deference, but purely internal states of consciousness like nausea, shame, pride, and alienation, all contacts with the other implies a latent contest. In order to eliminate God, Sartre makes nothingness prior to being. In a basic sense, nothingness is the given, and it ultimately governs his philosophy. The attempt of man to be God is a futile one, Sartre concludes in a famous passage. Every human being is a passion in that it projects losing itself so as to be found being, and by the same stroke to constitute the in itself which escapes contingency by being its own foundation, the ens causa sui, which religions call God. Thus, the passion of man is the reverse of that of Christ, for man loses himself as man in order that God may be born. But the idea of God is contradictory, and we lose ourselves in vain. Man is a useless passion. Sartre's philosophy gives us no reason for staying alive, and no reason for suicide either. Not only his man, but also his philosophy is a futile passion. His individual is the one and the many in a strange sense. Sartre's man is the one in existence, and the one as against the many, others. But Sartre's man is also the many in that he has no essence. He is a miscellaneous collection of anguish and agony seeking to be God, and all of it's a useless passion.